This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace.
Last year, I went through many different life changes. I needed to take a pause and examine how I was feeling in the inside to better show up for the ones who need me to be my best version of myself.
When you're navigating life's changes, Talkspace can help. Talkspace is the #1 rated online therapy, bringing you professional support from licensed therapists and psychiatry providers that you can access anytime, anywhere.
Living a busy life, navigating a long-distance relationship, becoming a first-step father, Talkspace made all of those journeys possible. I could speak with my therapist in the office. I could speak with my therapist in the comfort of my home. I was never alone.
Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay, no insurance, no problem. Now get $80 off your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
This week on Viewpoints.
What we saw was PDVSA's oil production went from 3.4 million barrels per day in around 2000, the early 2000s, and just went into a precipitous decline all the way down to about 600,000 barrels a day by 2020.
We trace the collapse of Venezuela's oil industry and why it matters today. Then,
you thought that a particular child was going to break down in tears because they really were very close to Grandpa Paul. But it turns out that they just look at you, kind of mute, and then say, "Can we have mac and cheese for lunch?"
What experts say actually helps kids understand and cope. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
In postseason football, you need to find that extra gear. On FanDuel, it's called Playoff Mode. Big boosts, more rewards, and a whole new way to live parlay with Drive SGP. Turn on Playoff Mode, only on FanDuel.
New customers bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. 21 plus and present in select states. First online real money wager only. $5 deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit rg-help.com.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace.
Last year, I went through many different life changes. I needed to take a pause and examine how I was feeling in the inside to better show up for the ones who need me to be my best version of myself.
When you're navigating life's changes, Talkspace can help. Talkspace is the #1 rated online therapy, bringing you professional support from licensed therapists and psychiatry providers that you can access anytime, anywhere.
Living a busy life, navigating a long-distance relationship, becoming a first-step father, Talkspace made all of those journeys possible. I could speak with my therapist in the office. I could speak with my therapist in the comfort of my home. I was never alone.
Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay, no insurance, no problem. Now get $80 off your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
In early January, Venezuela's longtime president, Nicolas Maduro, was captured by U.S. forces, flown to New York, and placed in federal custody. A move that sent shockwaves across the world and raised a question that's been on pause for years. If Maduro's authoritarian regime is truly over, will Venezuela's once booming oil industry make a comeback? The South American country is home to roughly 17% of all oil on the planet.
According to their estimates, they have 300 billion barrels, which makes them actually even larger than Saudi Arabia. So they have the largest reserves in the world. There is some skepticism around how much of those 300 billion barrels could actually be produced, but it's still a massive oil resource.
That's Skip York, a non-resident fellow for global oil at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. For several decades, Venezuela was a leader in oil production and was a rich country with a fast-growing economy.
Globally, Venezuela was one of the founding members of OPEC back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so they've had a long time been a player sort of in the geopolitics of oil, even before the days of OPEC. But that's another part of the reason why Venezuela is important to the global oil situation.
So how does the U.S. factor into this? Back in the 1990s, Venezuela's oil, which is a special strain of heavy, sour crude, was a resource that the country needed, so American oil companies invested billions of dollars and decades to build new refineries along the Gulf Coast that were designed to process this type of crude.
You have these refiners in the U.S. that made those investments, and now they want to earn a return on those investments. And Venezuelan oil is the best oil to suit those configurations. And so with the decline in Venezuela production over the last 20 years, they've had to go out and find other sources.
The U.S. eventually found other suppliers, but Venezuela's role was never easily replaced. To understand what might come next after Maduro's recent capture, York says it helps to look back at the rise and fall of the country's oil industry. At its peak, Venezuela was producing more than 3.5 million barrels of oil a day. That story begins in the 1950s, when the president of Venezuela at the time opened the country up to larger foreign investment.
He wanted not only the oil to be developed, but he wanted Venezuelan people trained and developed to work the operations in the fields and to benefit from it. So Venezuela benefited not only from producing the oil, but they also used that oil development as a way to spur other industries or to improve the education of the average the Venezuelans in the country. And so we go through the 1950s, we get to the 1970s, and the president of Venezuela at that time decides to nationalize the industry, meaning that he took ownership of the foreign oil companies' assets and he brought them back into the nation, and they created a company called PDVSA, and PDVSA is the national oil company of Venezuela. And PDVSA had those assets.
Venezuela was an outlier compared to other state oil producers. Its state-run company, PDVSA, became a symbol of stability and opportunity and was run by technical experts and engineers who knew how to manage complex oil assets. However, this began to change in the early 2000s after the president at the time, Hugo Chavez, moved to tighten political control over the industry after a large-scale strike.
In 2003, there was what was called the general strike broke out. Largely people upset with the way that Chavez was running the country and the direction he was taking the country in. And a number of the leaders of that general strike movement were PDVSA employees. Now that strike gets broken, and as a result, Chavez feels that PDVSA has had too much autonomy, and so he's going to now reassert control over PDVSA by appointing people into positions in PDVSA, and he ends up firing, I think it was close to 2/3 of the workforce.
In a short period, experienced engineers and managers were pushed out and were replaced by people with little background in oil operations. The result was a rapid and severe decline.
What we saw was PDVSA's oil production went from 3.4 million barrels per day in around 2000, the early 2000s, and just went into a precipitous decline all the way down to about 600,000 barrels a day by 2020. And a lot of that is a couple of things. As you're replacing people, technocrats is what they were referred to, as you're replacing the competent people in PDVSA that had been fired and now bringing in other people off the street that, didn't have the background. As PDVSA's operations declined, the government doubled down and just kept bringing in, just trying to assert more and more control rather than sort of, let's go back to the formula that made PDVSA work in the 1990s. The government just kept doubling down and trying to exert more and more control. And the more control it tried to exert, the more production would decline. And that's what sort of drug. And when PDVSA declined, it took the rest of the economy with it because it was, it is an oil-centric economy.
As oil output plummeted, so did revenue. And as conditions worsened and the government turned more oppressive, international sanctions followed, further isolating the industry.
The sanctions really reduced the number of markets that the Venezuelans had access to. And the sanctions also, outside of oil, there also were financial sanctions that limited their access to international banking. And the consequence of those sanctions was that the Venezuelans started to do more and more deals with Chinese and Russian oil companies.
Cut off from many Western markets, Venezuela's government turned to these two countries for financing and made deals that left much of its oil already spoken for. As production kept declining, that left less oil to sell and less money coming in. Even Venezuela's own refineries began to fail, turning a country with some of the largest oil reserves in the world into a net importer of fuel.
Before Chavez, in the 1990s, early 2000s, Venezuela was actually a net exporter not only of crude oil, but also of petroleum products to other countries in Latin America. As PDVSA declines and goes into arrears and assets stop performing, even the refineries stop performing as well. And so now Venezuela has gone from being a net exporter of petroleum products to a net importer of petroleum products, which is a bit ironic for a country that is sitting on such a vast oil reserves. They have to import fuel products from other parts of the world. And of course, where they can import those products from are also limited because those imports are also subject to sanctions.
With Maduro now in U.S. custody and political change possible, now the question is, will Venezuela's oil industry ever recover? And is there still enough global demand for it to have a seat at the table? We'll cover this topic in 2 weeks, in part 2 of this story. To learn more about our guest, Skip York, head to viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Instagram, X, and Facebook. This story was written by our executive producer, Amirah Zaveri. Our studio managers are Jay Silvers and Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.
Coming up, how to navigate difficult conversations as a parent in today's always connected world when Viewpoints returns. Some conversations change everything. They're the moments when words feel heavy, silence lingers, and there's no easy way to soften what comes next. For parents and caregivers, some of the hardest conversations involve trying to explain loss. Not just within a family, but in a world where children are increasingly exposed to these topics at a younger age through social media and a 24/7 news cycle. Dr. Elena Lister is no stranger to these difficult moments. Lister is a practicing adult, adolescent, and child psychiatrist at New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. She's also a faculty member at Columbia University and Cornell University and is a mother to 2 daughters. In her book, Giving Hope, she shares how her younger daughter, Liza, was diagnosed with terminal leukemia as a child, and how this diagnosis reframed her perspective on aging and death.
I think in general, our culture is death avoidant. And we're also aging avoidant. And if you just walk into any general large chain drugstore, you'll see rows of anti-aging creams. And, we all, I think, feel very uncomfortable with the idea that things are impermanent, that life is not going to last. And while we know it intellectually, we don't like to think about it and we don't like to talk about it.
After the diagnosis, Lister remembers some of the candid conversations she had with her daughter's classmates. She explained that Liza was very sick and wasn't going to live much longer, but that her family was making the most of the time she had left. The kids shared their own feelings and then asked questions. Some asked if Liza was nervous, if she was in pain, or if she'd ever come back to school. As a listener, you might be asking, why go into such detail with young kids?
What we have found over decades of experience, as well as what we believe, is that, in fact, the not talking about it is what leads kids to be more anxious. And I've had personal experience with this as well as professional, that when you can bring it out and talk about it with a child, they get the chance to ask their questions, to tell you what they're thinking, and to feel not alone with it, so they get less scared. So that protective instinct that comes from such a well-intentioned place actually ends up impairing a child in terms of dealing with what is an inevitable reality, sadly, in life.
As a psychiatrist and grief expert, she helps parents have these hard discussions. And these moments don't just come up when there's a loss in the family. They can happen after a prominent public death, a natural disaster, or a school shooting. All events that adolescents increasingly hear about on their own. According to Common Sense Media, children and teens now spend about 8 hours a day on their phones. Experts say that this level of exposure means many kids are encountering stories about death and violence on their own, often without the context or reassurance that an adult can give.
A decision that every parent has to make individually, but what we recommend is that if it is something that a child is inevitably going to hear about, which these days is probably most things, because even if they don't find it out on the internet by themselves, they might find it out from their 19-year-old cousin or somebody else, that you to open up the conversation with the child about it.
Lister says many parents underestimate just how much children already know and can sense.
We all want to spare our children upset, but there is no sparing upset about loss. It happens in our lives. And very importantly, if you as an adult who's taking care of a child are experiencing some sort of loss, if you don't choose to talk with a child about it, they're still going to sense that something is up with you. You're not yourself, no matter how hard you try to hide it and put on a smile and stiff upper lip. But children are really perceptive. They sense that something is off.
While it's important to give children context and clarity, is there an age where they're just too young?
We're generally thinking of a 3-year-old and up for any of these kinds of situations, because once a child is in school, they are around other children who may be talking about things. An internet may be accessible.
Research from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development supports this approach, saying that vague explanations can heighten anxiety in young children who tend to fill in gaps with their imagination.
If a child is asking for more information, it means that they need it, and you offer what they ask. I suggest you answer what they ask and you don't answer more. Sometimes when we're nervous, we fill in the blank with lots of talk. So I say stay very, very close to what the child is asking.
When having tough discussions, one tip is to put away distractions like phones and tablets and gather as a family. This shows that the news is being faced by everyone together. Another tip is to bring backup. Ideally, this means having another trusted adult present who can step in if emotions run high. When talking about death, Lister says explain what happened and then pause. Children need more time to process information than adults.
Expect the unexpected, and meaning that they may have not at all. You thought that a particular child was going to break down in tears because they really, really, really were very close to Grandpa Paul. But it turns out that they just look at you, kind of mute, and then say, "Can we have mac and cheese for lunch?" And that's okay, because it takes a while to process things, because every child has their own reaction. 2 siblings, one may cry and the other may not. And we want to advocate that you convey that that's fine. It doesn't mean that one sibling loved the person more than the other. It is just the reaction that each of them are having right then.
When answering questions, if you don't know how to answer in the moment, she says to be upfront with this feeling and circle back later.
It is fine to say to a child, I really want to answer that question and talk about it with you, but I need a few minutes to think about it. So how about if we come back to that question after lunch? And then, of course, you must come back to the question after lunch, even if you're still feeling a little uncertain. But it gives you a chance to kind of sort yourself out about how you might want to answer. Secondly, if let's say you do answer it and you weren't prepared, and then you think, oh gosh, I really botched that. Well, welcome to the human race. We all, as parents, botch things at times. So because it's not one conversation, it's many, you have the chance to go back to your child and say, when I was talking with you about Grandpa Joe and how he died, I don't feel really like I handled that well. I'd like to revisit it. Let's talk about it some more.
Oftentimes, one of the most difficult questions to answer is, did the person suffer when they died?
you can say, depending on the reality, it did not hurt when Grandpa Joe died. Or you know that Grandpa Joe's had a lot of pain. The pain went away when he died, because indeed we believe that people don't feel pain after they die. So you want to offer something to your child, I believe, that is truthful, but also has an element of reassurance in it. Another thing that you could do is kind of think to yourself, why is my child asking this particular question? Might they want to know if it hurt? And maybe they're just feeling a lot of empathy for Grandpa Joe, or maybe they're worried about when they hurt.
In the days and weeks after, she encourages parents to pay close attention and see how their child is coping. Grief can look different depending on age and personality, but persistent changes in sleep, behavior, or mood may signal a need for extra support.
When you would want to try to involve a professional or ask a professional whether it might be time for their involvement, might be 4 to 6 weeks after a significant loss, when a child is still demonstrating those things and cannot engage in regular life. They cannot stay in school yet. They're not sleeping. They're not eating. Maybe they've regressed. They've begun to wet the bed again or talk in baby talk. If those things are going on for more than 4 to 6 weeks, at that point, we think it's worth an adult in that child's life asking pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, the school counselor, a religious person. This is what I'm saying. Do you think they need more support?
Lister emphasizes that what matters most isn't having the perfect words, but being present, honest, and open as a parent or caregiver. To learn more about this topic and our guest, Dr. Elena Lister, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also, check out her book, Giving Hope, Conversations with Children About Illness, Death, and Loss, available online and in bookstores. This segment was written and produced by Amirah Zaveri. Our studio managers are Jay Silvers and Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
This is Viewpoints Explained. I'm Ebony McMorris. For a long time, nuclear power was seen as a political liability. It was costly, slow to build, and tied to huge nuclear disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima. However, as energy demand continues to rise and supply chains feel less dependable, this mindset is starting to shift. Everything from wars, trade disruptions, and fuel price swings are pushing leaders around the world to rethink where their power comes from and who controls it. And that's where nuclear energy comes into play. Today, more than 70 nuclear reactors are under construction, according to the World Economic Forum. Overall, the energy source only supplies about 10% of global electricity. But what it offers is reliable, around-the-clock power without toxic carbon emissions. Japan is one prime example of this shift back to nuclear. After the Fukushima disaster in 2011, the country shut down almost all of its power plants. Now, almost 15 years later, it's preparing to reopen its largest nuclear site as leaders hope to reduce its reliance on imported fossil fuels. Back in the U.S., nuclear is also gaining momentum. President Donald Trump has long been a vocal advocate, and the federal government recently awarded almost $3 billion to expand uranium enrichment, a move that secures fuel supply for future nuclear expansion. Meanwhile, critics argue that concerns around nuclear energy haven't disappeared. Power plants are still very expensive and can take years to build. Accidents, while rare, can have huge long-term consequences, and the disposal of toxic radioactive waste still has no permanent solution. Even with this, nuclear energy is expanding, not because it's perfect, but because governments are running out of reliable alternatives. That's Viewpoints Explained. More in a moment.
Welcome to Culture Crash, where we examine what's new and old in entertainment. The first few movies of 2026 have already started trickling out, but there's so much more where that came from. With big titles and notable directors lining up exciting projects, here are some of the movies I'm most looking forward to this year. One of the first big releases of 26 is coming on March 20th, when the Lord and Miller adaptation of Project Hail Mary hits theaters. Based on the novel by Andy Weir, who also wrote The Martian, Project Hail Mary features Ryan Gosling alongside an international ensemble launching a last-ditch one-in-a-million type mission to save humanity. Another promising sci-fi title this year is Disclosure Day, a new original film from Steven Spielberg and written by frequent Spielberg collaborator David Koepp. Disclosure Day stars Emily Blunt and Josh O'Connor and is all set to be a big summer blockbuster with its June 12th release date. Speaking of blockbusters, probably the most anticipated film of the year is The Odyssey, Christopher Nolan's first movie since Oppenheimer and an adaptation of the Homer epic with a cast too star-studded to name in full, but that includes Matt Damon, Lupita Nyong'o, Tom Holland, and Zendaya. This year we'll also see the release of Dune Part 3 from Denis Villeneuve, as well as The Adventures of Cliff Booth, a David Fincher-directed follow-up to Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that will see Brad Pitt return in his Oscar-winning role of Cliff Booth. Greta Gerwig will release her first movie since Barbie with Narnia, the Magician's Nephew, and Aaron Sorkin will unveil The Social Reckoning, a follow-up of sorts to The Social Network, but with a new cast and with Sorkin himself in the director's chair. While these are some of the big titles that the studios have been drumming up support for, every movie year is also full of small gems and little surprises. So here's to another year of sodas, popcorn, and candy at your local movie theater. I'm Evan Rook.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.